A snowstorm had already started around 7 p.m., and by the time my shift at the gas station ended, the weather had gotten so bad that visibility was barely 20 feet in front of the car. My manager offered to let me stay overnight in the storage room, but my apartment was only about 15 minutes away, so I figured I could make it home if I drove slowly. Looking back, I really wish I had stayed. The roads were almost completely empty. Snow kept piling up on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, and the headlights barely cut through the thick white haze blowing across the highway. About 10 minutes into the drive, I realized I might have made a mistake. The main road that led into town was blocked by a snowplow that had stopped sideways across the intersection. I waited for a minute, hoping the driver would move, but the truck just sat there with its hazard lights blinking weakly through the storm. So I did the only thing I could think of. I took the old side road that ran through the forest. Everyone in town called it Snow Road. It was technically a shortcut, but nobody liked driving there at night because there were long stretches with no houses, no street lights, and almost no cell signal. But at that moment, it seemed like the fastest way home. The deeper I drove into the forest, the worse the storm got. Snow piled up on the road so thick that I could barely see where the pavement ended and the ditch began. Trees on both sides of the road bent slightly under the weight of the snow, their branches forming dark tunnels that swallowed the weak glow of my headlights. I must have been driving for about 5 minutes when I saw something strange ahead. A light. At first, I thought it was another car coming toward me, but the light didn't move. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from a small house sitting just off the side of the road. The strange thing was that I had driven down Snow Road plenty of times during the day, and I didn't remember any houses being there. The place looked old. A single yellow porch light flickered above the front door, barely visible through the blowing snow. The windows were dark, and the roof was covered in such a thick layer of snow that it looked like the house had been sitting there untouched for years. I slowed down as I passed it, and that's when I noticed the footprints. They led from the road straight to the front door, but none came back. The car's tires crunched slowly over the thick layer of snow as I passed the house. I remember glancing at the porch one last time before continuing down the road, mostly because something about the place felt wrong. Not abandoned exactly, but not lived in either, just waiting. I had almost driven past it completely when something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Movement. I instinctively tapped the brakes and leaned forward slightly, trying to see through the snow blowing across the back window. For a second, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes, but then I saw it again. Someone was standing on the porch. I was certain that the porch had been empty when I drove past. I would have noticed a person standing there in the middle of a blizzard. But now there was a figure under the dim porch light, just standing there, completely still. They weren't waving for help. They weren't moving at all, just watching the road. I told myself they were probably the homeowner who had just stepped outside, maybe to see how bad the storm had gotten. That explanation made sense, but something about the way they were standing bothered me. Their posture was stiff, almost unnatural, like they hadn't moved for a long time. For a moment, I considered stopping the car. It was freezing outside, and if someone needed help during a storm like this, ignoring them felt wrong. But the longer I looked at the figure through the mirror, the more uncomfortable I felt. They were facing my car. And even from that distance, I had the strange feeling they were staring directly at me. I slowly pressed the gas pedal and continued down the road. The forest swallowed the house behind me within seconds. The headlights lit up nothing but snow and trees again, and the only sound inside the car was the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers. I tried to shake the feeling off,
but about 30 seconds later, my phone lost signal completely. That wasn't unusual for Snow Road. The cell towers barely reached that far into the woods. Still, the sudden silence made the whole drive feel even more isolated. The road curved slightly to the left, and I slowed down so the tires wouldn't slide on the ice. That's when I saw something ahead. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch in the middle of the road. But as I got closer, the headlights revealed something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. A single line of footprints walking down the center of the road. I slowed the car almost to a stop. The prints looked fresh, like someone had walked there just seconds ago. Snow was still falling heavily, but the edges of the prints hadn't filled in yet. The strange thing was, they were leading in the same direction I was driving, which meant whoever made them had to be somewhere ahead of me on the road. But there was no one there, just empty snow-covered asphalt disappearing into the dark forest. I rolled the car forward slowly, my headlights tracing over each footprint as I followed the trail. For about 20 yards, the prints stayed perfectly centered in the road, spaced evenly like someone walking at a calm, steady pace. Then, suddenly, they stopped. Not turned off into the woods, not faded away, stopped. The last footprint sat alone in the middle of the road, like whoever made it had simply vanished into thin air. I felt a chill run through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. I looked up from the road and scanned the tree line on both sides of the car. The woods were thick and dark, branches heavy with snow. If someone had stepped off the road into the trees, there would be new prints leading into the forest, but there weren't any. The only marks in the snow were the ones directly in front of my car. I sat there for a few seconds, engine idling, trying to convince myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the wind had covered the other prints. Maybe they had jumped into the ditch. But then I noticed something that made the situation even worse. The prints weren't leading away from me. They were leading toward me, which meant whoever made them had been walking down the road directly in front of my car. And I hadn't seen them. My heart started beating faster as I slowly turned my head toward the rearview mirror again. The road behind me stretched empty through the storm, but in the distance, through the snow, I could just barely make out the faint glow of a porch light. The same house I had passed earlier, and standing under that light again was the same figure, still completely motionless, still facing the road, still watching. Except this time, I realized something that made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. The figure wasn't standing on the porch anymore. It was standing in the middle of the road, right where the footprints ended. And it was much closer than before. So close that I was suddenly sure of one thing. Those footprints in the snow hadn't been leading away from the house. They had been leading from it, directly toward my car. And whatever had been standing on that porch had been following me down Snow Road the entire time.
I didn't notice the car at first. The snowstorm had started earlier that evening, and by the time I left my friend's house, the entire highway was almost completely empty. It was the kind of storm where the snow fell so thick that it looked like thousands of tiny white particles floating through the headlights. Most people had already stayed home for the night, but I still had a 40-minute drive ahead of me. The road leading out of my friend's neighborhood was narrow and surrounded by tall pine trees. Snow had already started covering the pavement, and my tires occasionally slid slightly whenever I slowed down too quickly. For the first 10 minutes of the drive, everything was normal. Just the sound of the heater running, the windshield wipers squeaking across the glass, and the constant hiss of snow hitting the car. Then,
I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much about it. It wasn't strange for another car to be on the road, even during a storm like this. But after a few minutes, I noticed something odd. The headlights stayed exactly the same distance behind me, not getting closer, not falling back, just following. I turned onto the main highway that led toward my town. Normally, this road had plenty of traffic, but that night it was completely empty. Just me and the car behind me. I drove for another 5 minutes before curiosity got the better of me. I slowed down slightly to see if the driver would pass me. The headlights slowed down too. I sped up again. The headlights matched my speed perfectly. That's when I started feeling uneasy. Maybe they were just being cautious in the snow, I told myself. But the strange part was that I couldn't actually see the car itself. The snowstorm was so thick that the headlights blurred into the swirling snow behind me. All I could see were 2 bright white circles floating in the darkness. Another few minutes passed like that. Then, suddenly, the headlights disappeared. I frowned and checked the mirror again. Nothing, just darkness and blowing snow. For a moment, I assumed the driver must have turned off onto a side road somewhere behind me. That explanation made sense, but something about the way the lights vanished so suddenly felt strange. Still, I tried not to think about it, until about 30 seconds later. The headlights came back, much closer this time. I almost jumped when they suddenly appeared in the mirror again. Now they were only about 3 car lengths behind me. I instinctively pressed the gas pedal a little harder. My car sped up. The headlights sped up too. The road ahead curved through a stretch of forest where the trees grew thick on both sides. Snow piled up heavily on the branches, creating a tunnel-like effect that made the road feel even darker and more isolated. I glanced at my phone sitting on the passenger seat. No signal, of course. The deeper parts of that highway barely had any reception. I kept my eyes on the road and tried to ignore the lights behind me, but they stayed there, constant, unmoving, matching every speed change I made. At one point, I decided to test something. I turned onto a random side road that I knew eventually looped back to the highway. The headlights followed immediately. My stomach tightened. Okay, now that was weird. That road didn't lead anywhere important. There were no houses there, no stores, nothing but a long stretch of forest that eventually curved back to the highway. Yet the car followed me anyway. Snow was falling even harder now, making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. The road narrowed as the trees closed in around it. I looked in the mirror again. The headlights were still there, closer now, maybe 2 car lengths away. I couldn't see the driver. I couldn't even clearly see the shape of the car. Just those same 2 bright headlights glowing through the storm. Then, something happened that made my heart start pounding. The headlights suddenly turned off. The road behind me went completely dark. No lights, no car, nothing. I slowed down, confused. Had the driver turned their lights off on purpose? Why would someone do that in the middle of a snowstorm on a dark road? For a moment, I thought maybe they had stopped. But when I glanced back again, the headlights turned on, right behind me, so close now that the bright light filled the entire rearview mirror. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. At that point, I was sure of one thing. Whoever was in that car wasn't just coincidentally driving behind me. They were following me. The road ahead finally curved back toward the highway. I turned onto it quickly, hoping the open road would make things feel less isolated. The moment my car straightened out on the highway, the headlights behind me disappeared again. This time, they didn't come back. I drove another 20 minutes before reaching the edge of town. Streetlights finally appeared along the road, casting yellow pools of light across the snow-covered pavement. Only then did I finally relax a little. I told myself the other driver must have turned around or taken a different road. Maybe they were just another person trying to navigate the storm. But when I parked outside my apartment building and turned the engine off, I looked down at the snow on the ground beside my car. Fresh tire tracks led into the parking lot, my tracks, and one other set, following directly behind me. But they stopped about 10 feet away from my car, like the other vehicle had been there, watching me park, and then slowly backed away into the storm.
The strange part is, I checked the security cameras on the parking lot the next day. My building has 2 cameras that cover the entrance and the parking area. I watched the footage from the night before. Around the time I arrived, my car pulled into the lot exactly like I remembered. Snow was falling heavily, but the camera still captured the headlights behind me entering the parking lot. The second car stopped about 10 feet behind mine, just like the tire tracks showed. But when I looked closer at the footage, something felt wrong, very wrong, because when the car stopped, the driver's door never opened. In fact, no one got out of the car at all. The headlights stayed on for almost 30 seconds. Then slowly, the car reversed out of the parking lot and disappeared back into the snowstorm. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me, so I paused the footage and zoomed in on the car. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was no one in the driver's seat. The car had been following me for almost an hour, and there was no driver inside it.
The trip was supposed to be relaxing. 3 of us had rented a small cabin in the mountains for a weekend during winter break. It was the kind of place people go to escape the city for a few days. Snow everywhere, tall pine trees, and barely any cell service. My friends, Daniel and Chris, had found the cabin online. It was cheap, isolated, and according to the pictures, it looked perfect. A small wooden cabin sitting in the middle of a forest, surrounded by nothing but snow. The owner had sent us the address and instructions to pick up the key near the front door. Simple. The drive there took almost 3 hours. By the time we reached the mountain road, the sun had already started setting. Snow covered everything. The road, the trees, even the rooftops of the few houses we passed along the way. Eventually, the GPS told us to turn onto a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the forest. The deeper we drove, the quieter everything became. No houses, no streetlights, just trees. After about 10 minutes of driving slowly through the snow-covered road, the cabin finally appeared between the trees. It looked exactly like the photos. A small wooden cabin with a front porch, a chimney, and a thin layer of snow covering the roof. There were no other cabins nearby, just ours. We grabbed the key from the lockbox, carried our bags inside, and turned on the lights. The interior was warm and cozy. Wooden walls, a fireplace in the living room, and 2 small bedrooms. For the first few hours, everything felt normal. We cooked dinner, played cards, and talked while the snowstorm outside slowly got heavier. Around 11 p.m., Daniel said he was tired and went to bed. Chris stayed up a little longer watching something on his phone before he eventually fell asleep on the couch. I was the last one awake. The wind outside had started howling through the trees, occasionally rattling the cabin walls. Snow kept hitting the windows in soft bursts as the storm continued getting worse. Around midnight, I finally decided to go to sleep too. Before heading to my room, I walked over to the front window and looked outside. The entire forest was covered in white. The snow reflected just enough moonlight to make the trees faintly visible in the distance. Everything looked calm, peaceful. Then I noticed something strange. Footprints. They started near the edge of the trees and continued across the snow toward the cabin. My first thought was that they belonged to one of us earlier when we arrived, but something about them didn't make sense. The prints were fresh, sharp, like they had been made only minutes ago. I stared at them for a few seconds, trying to understand where they came from. They led straight toward the cabin, right up to the front door. But from where I was standing inside, I couldn't see any footprints leaving, just a single trail coming out of the forest. My chest tightened a little. Maybe someone had walked past earlier. Maybe they turned around somewhere I couldn't see. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, I checked the front door to make sure it was locked. Then I turned off the living room light and went to bed. For a while, everything was quiet. The kind of quiet you only get deep in the mountains, where there's no traffic, no people, and no distant city noise. Just wind and snow. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know why. The cabin was completely dark. Then I heard it. A slow, crunching sound. Outside. It sounded exactly like someone walking through snow. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. The sound moved slowly across the front of the cabin. My heart immediately started beating faster. At first, I thought it might be one of my friends going outside for some reason. But then I remembered something. The footprints earlier. I slowly sat up in bed and listened carefully. Crunch. The sound stopped, right outside the window of my room. I held my breath. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. Then, I heard something else. A faint scraping against the glass, like someone slowly dragging their fingers across the outside of the window. Every muscle in my body went completely still. I forced myself to slowly turn my head toward the window beside the bed, but the curtains were closed. I couldn't see anything outside. The scraping sound stopped. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time moving towards the front porch. I quickly grabbed my phone and checked the time. 3:12 a.m. For a moment, I thought about waking Daniel and Cress, but before I could move, something happened that made my stomach drop. 3 slow knocks echoed through the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. They came from the front door. Not loud, not aggressive, just slow, deliberate knocking. I stayed frozen in bed, listening. Another long silence followed. Then the footsteps returned, this time moving away from the cabin. Crunch, 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 gradually fading back towards the trees. I waited a long time before finally getting out of bed. My hands were shaking as I quietly walked into the living room. Chris was still asleep on the couch. Daniel's bedroom door was closed. Neither of them seemed to have heard anything. The cabin was completely silent again. I walked slowly toward the front window and carefully lifted the curtain just enough to see outside. Fresh snow covered the ground, and there they were, footprints, leading from the porch back towards the forest. But something about them made my stomach twist, because halfway across the yard, they stopped. No turning around, no second trail, just footprints that suddenly ended in the middle of the snow, like something had been standing there, watching the cabin for a very long time.